Belonging is a bit of a catch-all term. I often find myself in conversations where two people are talking about belonging, but they're talking about different things. That's perfectly understandable because the word belonging has many meanings. I would even argue that it has many dimensions. That's what we're going to be talking about today, about the different dimensions of belonging and how this framework of looking at the different dimensions might help you not only to understand belonging better, but also get into your own belonging. So, for those of you that are new to the podcast, my name is Matteo Pornico, and this is Create Belonging, the podcast where we explore the world through the lens of belonging. I also want to welcome you to the new season of Create Belonging. And today we're not going to bring out a guest like I usually do, but rather we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the concept of belonging. In particularly, we're going to look at the three dimensions of belonging. And the reason why we're going to go a little bit deeper into the topic of belonging and explore the different dimensions of belonging is because I've had many conversations here on the pod and outside of the pod. Maybe I was talking to you once about belonging, and I find that there are many definitions of belonging and many angles from where to approach the topic of belonging. So I thought that by looking at this framework, we could understand belonging a little bit better. I also noticed that a lot of people seem to be fixed on a particular type of belonging, and they don't identify or they haven't really realized that there are different types of belonging or different entry points to belonging. And so hopefully by the end of this episode, we'll be able to give you a little bit more frames of references so that you can become a little bit more agile when it comes to talking about belonging. So in this series, we will start looking at the three dimensions of belonging with the aim to give you a new perspective and thinking of belonging. And hopefully you'll be able to use these three dimensions to help you reconnect with your own sense of belonging, but also help others see belonging in a new light. So let's get started. For those of you that are just give me the answer right away, I'm just going to give you the framework right now so that maybe to satisfy your curiosity. So the framework is quite simple. And the three dimensions are belonging with yourself, which is a very internal dimension, belonging with others, which is the external dimension, and belonging with the world or the universe, which is a very universal dimension, right? So those are the three dimensions. But if for those of you that want to go in a little bit deeper into each dimension, please stand by because I've prepared a lot of research. It's important to understand that these three dimensions are not a hierarchy per se. In fact, I could have just reversed the order, but in reality, there is no hierarchy. One could argue, of course, you belong to yourself first and foremost, and that's step one. And then step two will be belonging to others before you could belong to the universe. But also the reverse is also true, right? I know a lot of people that feel this deep sense of connection to other people, but they really haven't connected with themselves either, or even connected to the environment and to the world outside people. So these three dimensions, like I said, they're not in any hierarchical level, and they're not a step-by-step guide into finding your belonging, but rather think of them as entry points. And here I'm reminded of the powerful metaphor by Venn, who is also a guest on the podcast and who wrote the most amazing book. Hold on, let me just go get it. Here we go. It's this book, You Belong, by Venn, which is a huge influence in how I think about belonging in this world. And she talks of belonging as being your compass. So your sense of belonging is like a compass, but everybody has their own individual maps. So you have your map of belonging and I have my own map of belonging. I don't know exactly how you find your belonging, but I can teach you how to use your compass and read the map. So all the key, the map key and the legend. And this is what I'm trying to do with this podcast, and is to give you more tools and to give you more definitions and more ways of reading your map with different map keys. So these three dimensions of belonging are just that, are going to give you a different framework and a different way of looking at belonging. So now let's dive right into the three dimensions. Just remember that these are not mutually exclusive dimensions. Each dimension is available for us to experience at any moment. So, are you still with me? Great. Let's look at the first dimension, which is belonging with the self. Now, this first dimension of belonging is like the sense of coming home to yourself. I know it's a little bit of a fluffy word, but bear with me. This is also known as the internal dimension of belonging, and it's where a lot of people that talk about this, your sense of belonging, your feeling of belonging, that's where you will find this internal dimension of belonging. Belonging in this sense, belonging to yourself, doesn't require you to be anything else but yourself. It's about understanding who you truly are. And it's very much closely related to the idea of authenticity. Now, on that topic about authenticity and belonging and the cross-section between those two, I will be doing a separate episode on that because there's a lot to dive in on that. But for now, it's good to understand that belonging to the self is fundamental to belonging and true belonging. In fact, this is what Brené Brown calls true belonging. And I picked up her book here, Braving the Wilderness. The subtitle is The Quest for True Belonging and the Courage to Stand Alone. And in this book, Brené Brown talks about the idea that to truly belong, you need to accept that you will only belong to yourself. That it can be both an empowering feeling, but also a very lonely feeling. It's about embracing the paradoxical nature of belonging, where we feel like we belong nowhere and we belong everywhere at the same time. Brené Brown describes this as a spiritual practice in believing in belonging to yourself so deeply that you can share the most authentic self with the world and find sacredness in both being part of something and standing alone in the wilderness. Brené Brown also implores the "Men in the Arena" quote by Teddy Roosevelt, which is an amazing quote that I'm not going to read to you right now, but pretty much to sum it up is about that to truly belong is understanding that you are first and foremost on your own. And once you get comfortable with that feeling that you will only truly belong to yourself, then you can show up to the world differently and create more true connections out in the world. So how do you know when you're in this dimension? When you're in this dimension, when you belong with yourself, you feel like you are your authentic self. You're not trying to fit in. You're not compromising your values or other aspects of you. You are truly comfortable. And I mean comfortable, connected, sense of calm, and a sense of empowerment that you are your true self. It's very similar to the concept of internal alignment or integrity. It's not perfection, but a sense that you're living from your actual values. And what I found is that when you are in solid relationship to yourself, connecting with others becomes more genuine. Also, when you are truly knew who you are and you're connecting with others, you could also extend your feeling of belonging and you could identify yourself from others. So when we're exploring these dimensions, we're going to look at ways that people get stuck in them. For this first dimension, sometimes this dimension feels inaccessible. And of course, like in many ways, if you cannot locate yourself and your belonging, then maybe it's better to go in through the other two dimensions. But many people who live in service of others have a hard time to understand that they belong to themselves. And when we explore the second dimension, we'll see why people even get stuck there as well. But people who might feel stuck in this internal dimension might be plagued by the feeling that they don't really belong anywhere except with their own. This feeling might be valid. In fact, they might be in places where they really are not relating to others or to their environment. However, if we don't explore the other dimensions, getting stuck there of that you belong only to yourself can be in many ways grounding, but it should not make you feel stuck there. In fact, it should motivate you to take action to go look at the other dimensions of belonging. But before we move on to the second dimension of belonging, I wanted to ask you, what comes up for you when we talk about belonging to yourself? When do you feel the most like yourself? And do you feel resistance at any point when I mention it here, when I mention that you belong to yourself and nowhere else? What is that resistance about? Perhaps it's giving you a new way of looking at belonging that you didn't really understand before. Okay, now let's look at the second dimension. And that is belonging with others. This is perhaps the only dimension that you ever thought about when you're thinking about belonging, because belonging, of course, has a definition that is very much externally focused, where it's about belonging with others around you, and it's very closely related to the concept of inclusion and society and fitting in and so many other things that we think about when we think about belonging. But this second dimension is not just about having people around you, but it's about feeling that you're truly seen and valued for who you are. And for that reason, this is where a lot of us default to when we think about belonging, because after all, we are social animals where we have evolved to live in tribes and in communities. And this is where perhaps 80% of the conversations around belonging gravitate towards, which is the belonging with others. The second dimension is the external dimension. And where internal is belonging to the self, belonging with others is external. And this is also called the relative dimension of belonging. That is the sense that when we belong, when we relate to somebody else. That means that nobody to relate to, then there is no belonging. Another reason why this dimension is so important is because of our nervous system. It's already pointing externally. I mean, we have two eyes and we have ears to capture everything else that's coming to us. So we are very externally focused because that's where the danger and also the safety can come in. And so naturally, this dimension of belonging with others is so important and fundamental. And so what does this dimension feel like when we belonging with others? What does that mean? In many ways, is that feeling that you get when you are truly seen by others. Now, I remember the first time I felt truly seen as an adult, because I like to believe that as a kid and I've felt seen by my parents many times. But when somebody truly sees you, that feeling, it's almost a little bit uncomfortable, but it's also quite warm and true. It's also the experience of being in spaces where you don't have to explain yourself. I've had many guests that, for example, Lola Kimede talked about feeling relaxed when you're amongst others. So obviously, belonging with others is not about fitting in. This dimension doesn't require us to give up part of who we are in order to belong. Rather, we should feel like this relationship that we have with others is for mutual benefit. One way of looking at it sometimes is the idea that you can be in conversation with your friends and being able to just enjoy and be comfortable in a moment of silence. So let's talk about why people might feel blocked or get stuck in this dimension. Now, when you're belonging with others. And it's also very, very important to our survival because, as I said, we are social animals. But when it's the only path we know to belong, we might feel like we will need to sacrifice ourselves or our authenticity to maintain connections. And it also, when we get stuck in this dimension of trying to belong, we might even fall into a situation where we are dependent on others. And for example, we're depending on others' affections, on other opinions, and basically you are outsourcing your belonging to others and opinions that might not be true to you. Also, another trap of the second dimension is, of course, feeling like you don't belong with others. This is very common, something that I have experienced, and hopefully you have experiences. And the reason why I say hopefully is because I find that the feeling of not belonging is what gets people to truly understand and question where do they belong. And it leads them to explore different possibilities and different dimensions of belonging. So in this case, this feeling that we don't belong with the people around us could lead us potentially to something good, but it's also a very painful experience. Research shows that the feeling of exclusion and not belonging is as real and as painful as physical harm to us. Also, this dimension of belonging with others is tricky because people are not fixed entities. And you might find that the people around you might change and might go away, or even you might change setting. And there might be a period of adjustment until you could really understand how you belong among those people. So belonging with others embraces that very dynamic quality of belonging that we don't find in the other two dimensions, which tend to be a little bit more stable. So to conclude this section on belonging with others, I guess is the most obvious thing to say is that this is the most obvious dimension of belonging. And for good reason, because we are social animals and we are always interacting with others. And we have a basic need of feeling like we're seen and valued and acknowledged. It's also where most of the definitions and where most of the conversations that you will have will focus on the second dimension of belonging. But it's also one of the tricky ones to talk about because a lot of people equate belonging with others as fitting in. And so we get again into that paradox, which is you yourself, you have to be an individual. You have to be yourself. But at the same time, you have to find ways of being your authentic self amongst other authentic selves. And that in today's world might not be the easiest thing to do. What's also important to understand is that this dimension, perhaps because it's the most widely available one, belonging with others, is also the one that many of us leads us to the other two dimensions. So we talked about excluding and not being welcomed by the people around you. That can either throw you into crisis or it could actually push you and propel you to seek other ways of belonging, hopefully to the other two dimensions that we talked about. But before we talk about the third and final dimension, I just wanted to ask you some questions to get you to think about this dimension a little bit more deeply. So when do you feel truly seen by others? And when you look at the connections in your life that truly matter, what makes them so? Are you able to still tap into your sense of belonging when you don't quite fit in? And what is that dance or that paradox like for you? Okay, so you're still with me? Now we're going to look at the third dimension of belonging, and that is belonging with everything. By everything, I mean the world, the planet, the universe. And perhaps this is the most overlooked dimension of belonging. This is about belonging to something greater than yourself, greater than the people around you. It's about belonging to the plants, the trees, the rocks, the water, the planet, and the stars. In other words, it's about belonging to the natural world. This is also maybe perhaps the one that lets people closer to think about religion. And when we think about belonging to something else bigger than ourselves and other people, other deities and other external forces, perhaps that could be it. But it also could be belonging to the ecosystem, belonging with other living beings and even the non-living beings. This is the dimension that Ubuntu lives in. For those of you that don't know Ubuntu, I really would recommend that you look up the African philosophy of Ubuntu, which basically says that I am because you are, which captures a sense of fundamental interconnectedness to life and to everything that surrounds us. It's the idea of a shared sense of humanity with other parts of this world. You might experience this when you are looking at a night sky and you feel like you are amongst the stars, or that there's just nothing really separating between you and all the universe around you. Or when we are outside in nature, walking, even when you're speaking to your pet, for example. So one way of looking at this is that research talk about something called biophilia, which is a term popularized by the biologist E.O. Wilson. And he suggests that humans have an innate tendency to seek connections with nature and other forms of life. It's not just a preference, it's a biological programming developed over millions and millions of years. I mean, this is not just an abstract philosophy. Studies show that when people feel connected to nature, report higher levels of well-being. Also, I mean, we have a ton of science and studies talking about the connection between humans and the environment. Think about forest bathing, that Japanese art of just going around and walking in the forest, and it's been proven that it improves health in so many ways. And people that feel connected to nature have higher levels of well-being. And even a brief exposure to the natural environment can reduce stress and improve mental clarity. Now, I don't need to convince you that we as humans thrive when we're connected to the environment. However, this is true because this third dimension of belonging is also true. We belong to everything around us. This is also the dimension of compassion, where we extend our welfare and well-meaning kindness to others and other things in this world. I know it's not so common, but some people might even get stuck in this dimension. Not only they get stuck, but they might not even be able to access it. And society in general refers to nature and the environment as something that is not necessarily here. I mean, the environment is out there. And we forget that the environment is everything. The city I live in is the environment, right? And the lines that we have created between what's natural and not, and what is the environment and not, those are just human constructs. And there are some people that sometimes use this dimension, this third dimension, as their way into belonging. They probably don't feel like they belong to themselves or for others, but they have a deep connection to the environment. I'm thinking of those monks or ascetic people that have renounced everything about themselves, their identity and their humanness, and have chosen to live in the forest, for example. Now, this third dimension is also a way into that first or second dimensions. So before I talk about how we integrate those three dimensions, I wanted to ask you about this third dimension and ask you to think about, when was the last time you felt really connected to nature? Have you ever felt connected to something that is not living? Could be a rock, could be a body of water. I know a lot of people feel deep connection to the sea. And how is that relationship? Do you feel accepted? Do you feel like something is reflected back at you in that dimension? So we had an in-depth look at those three dimensions. And now let's try to organize them or wrap them up to be a little bit more strategic with it. So now let's talk about how these interact, these three dimensions, and to maybe get a little bit more understanding the dance between the different dimensions. So the first thing to understand is that these aren't separate dimensions that you need to go on. They're not levels, as I mentioned earlier. They're not a hierarchy, and they're not absolutes. That means that, oh, if I'm in dimension 1, I cannot be in dimension 2, or I cannot be in dimension 1 and jump to 3 because I don't have the second dimension. That's a very limited way of looking at this, and it might not help. Now, perhaps the easiest way to look at this is to see them as a Venn diagram. So imagine 3 circles. If you're aware of the Ikigai principle, you might know what I'm talking about. And so you have those 3 dimensions that are interlocking. And you might find yourself that sometimes you're in just one dimension, sometimes in one and the other, but not the third one. And sometimes you might even find that you belong to yourself, to others, and to the universe. Now, those moments are very rare, but they're not impossible. And hopefully you have experienced that sense of belonging, of true belonging. It's what I like to call complete belonging or real belonging. I'm not in that all the time, but through my various practices and getting grounded, I do find myself being able to access those moments of real belonging. The other thing to understand is that I talked about it briefly, but these are like, think of these as gateways to belong, right? So sometimes, depending on the context where we are, we might only have the third dimension only because we don't feel like we know ourselves, or we don't recognize ourselves with others. So the only thing that we have is to connect to the universe. Or vice versa. Sometimes we feel like we belong only amongst others, but we have no real sense of belonging to ourselves. So think of these as entry points to other ways of belonging. Also, these dimensions of belonging support each other. So they might empower you and drive you to go on to another dimension. Now, I have prepared a PDF with the Venn diagram and the different zones mapped out that hopefully you will find it useful. If you would like a copy of this PDF download, please get in touch with me at createbelonging@gmail.com. Visit my website, or please find me, Matteo Bornico, on LinkedIn and send me a message. Tell me that you would like to receive this PDF, and I'll more than glad send it over to you. And as we're wrapping up this episode, I hope that you really found a lot of value to it. I've done a ton of research on this. I know that I'm not going to be setting it all right here, but in the PDF that I prepared has all those interesting books and articles that I looked into to help you if you want to dig a little bit deeper into this topic. So as I conclude this episode, I mean, I've been talking for quite some time now. I just want to say that belonging isn't just something to achieve or to earn. but it's something to explore and experience. And so when we look at the 3 dimensions, don't think of them as requirements that you need to meet. Think of them as different ways of remembering that you already belong. Remember that belonging is like your compass and that your map is unique. So make sure that you're in tune with your compass so then you can go create belonging for yourself and for others. Thank you so much. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. And if you're listening, please don't forget to subscribe wherever you're getting this episode, as well as if you're watching on YouTube, please give it a thumbs up. And I can't believe I'm actually saying this. Don't forget to smash that like button and click subscribe for more Create Belonging. No, but in seriousness, this has been a labor of love. And I hope that you can really appreciate all the work that I'm putting behind. So don't forget to get in touch with me. Please send me your feedback. Let me know if you enjoyed this episode, if you thought about these 3 levels as something that you never thought about, or if you had thought about it, but you never had words for it, or if you think that I'm completely wrong, please send me that feedback. I would love to interact with you and the rest of the Create Belonging community. Until then, go create belonging for yourself and for others. Thank you. Bye.